grew up in church, and as a young person, I was president of a youth group in church and was very active. And after I graduated from high school, I went on to Bible college. So my mind was very much directed towards thinking on these subjects. I always believed that man had free will, but I was also taught that we're unable to obey God because we have a sinful nature. So I was caught between these two things, not understanding their conflict. I wasn't developed enough to understand the implications of the difference between free will and not able to do God's will. Free will is the ability that man has to choose to obey or disobey the moral law. Now, some people have an incorrect definition of that. For example, Jonathan Edwards taught that a free will is the ability to do whatever you choose to do. For example, if you choose to fly and you're not able to fly, he would say that's proof you do not have a free will. But his definition is faulty. Another definition of free will that is faulty is the ability to do whatever you want to do. So if you want to feel a certain way, or if you want to not feel a certain way, and you can't by your decisions feel a certain way, and some people say that's evidence that you don't have a free will. But that's not what free will is about, choosing your emotions, which are involuntary. Other people would say that free will is the ability to prevent what you don't want, to prevent suffering, to prevent misery, to prevent pain. And since you can't prevent what you don't want and don't like, then they say you don't have free will. So these false ideas of free will have led people astray in the question of, does man have free will? And free will is the ability to choose between obeying the moral law or disobeying the moral law, doing what your responsibility is or refusing to do your moral responsibility. Now, the early church was very clear in their ideas of free will of man. The leaders that came after the apostles were called the apostolic fathers. The next were called the apologists. And into the 2nd century, they were called the church fathers, and they all agreed that man has a free will. They all agreed that the commandments of God put man in the responsible position to respond in obedience, and that if they disobey, that is why he could be held guilty. So they were unanimous, the early church, in believing that man does have a free will. The Bible does not teach that free will was lost. The Bible assumes that God created man with free will in the first place. Man does not have the ability to change his nature, and free will is part of his nature. God would not destroy man's nature because he said he made it good. And the devil, he cannot change man's nature. He doesn't have the ability to create. So there's no possible way that he could lose part of his nature. God wouldn't do it. Man can't do it. The devil can't do it. So the way that God created man is the way that man has continued to be. And God has held him responsible to obey his commandments from the beginning of the Garden of Eden, all the way through the Old Testament, into the New Testament. His commands of the moral law, God is assuming and revealing man has a free will with the ability to obey. All of God's pronouncements for punishment and condemnation assumes that in God's mind, man is properly condemned because he has the ability to obey. So for these considerations, we know that the Bible assumes. It doesn't try to prove it because it assumes what is just naturally known, that man has a free will, and therefore the Bible assumes it in all of its proclamations. And Paul, the apostle of grace, added to this knowledge and understanding when he wrote to Philemon in the book of Philemon, chapter 14. He says to Philemon, whom he is asking to take back his servant who has become a disciple of Jesus, he says to Philemon, "But without your consent, I did not want to do anything, that your goodness should not be as it were by compulsion, but of your own free will." So Paul the apostle relates to other people and calls upon them to do something, but to do it according to their own free will and not under compulsion. And this is high evidence that the Bible asserts that man has not lost his free will. Gnosticism was a movement for several hundred years in the ancient Middle Eastern world over into the western part of the Roman Empire. It lasted for several centuries. It was like a large umbrella idea under which were many different sects or different groups, or we might call them denominations, something like that. They believed that the material world was evil. They believed that man had a participation in the material world, so his body was evil, and that is where his evil or sin dwelt. But they believed his spirit was pure, so that they believed in his spirit he was holy or pure without sin, but his body is where the sin was. Now, the Gnostics in general believed that in heaven there was these disembodied spirits living in heaven, and they would fall into this earth, this lower realm, and come into bodies and live here in bodies and live in this afflicted place where they would have these sinful bodies that they had to try to cope with, even though they were pure, holy spirits, as they might describe them. They called Jehovah in the Old Testament the demiurge, that he's the one that created everything that we see in these bodies, but he wasn't really God. The true God is above the Jehovah of the Old Testament in their idea. They believe that the salvation that would come to them would come through knowledge and not through faith, so that you're saved by knowledge, not faith. And they believe that this knowledge would be given to you in order for you to have this salvation, so that you, when you died, would you go back up to the disembodied state in heaven, and you had no choice whether to receive the knowledge or not. It would just be given to you. And that's how you knew that you had salvation, because you had this special knowledge that nobody could teach you. You couldn't teach it to somebody else. But if you had it, and you knew it, and that's how you knew you were one of, quote, the elect in their terminology. So that was Gnosticism. And in the view of regarding free will, Gnostics taught that man does not have a free will. It's a fatalistic situation in which there's heaven and the Prince of Light, and then which there's down here below in the earth, and the Prince of Darkness, and you got this continual warfare going on between the two kingdoms and the two princes, and there's nothing you can do about it. Everything that happens to you is either under the influence of one or the other, and then nothing you can do about it. So they were a fatalistic belief. Manichaeism is a form of Gnosticism. It was started by a man named Mani, a Persian man, who in 250 A.D. began his movement from Persia. He taught people that he was the Paraclete, or the one that Jesus promised would come and teach them all things. And he said, I am that one. And so he taught people various mystical ideas, but Gnostic ideas, where there was the Prince of and Kingdom of Light above, and Kingdom of Darkness and Prince of Darkness below, and that the Manichaeans lived in these sinful bodies, although they were pure inside, if they would practice very ascetic disciplines, such as not participating in sexual activities, not eating particular meats. They were vegetarians, and this was their way of trying to rise higher and higher to reach into the celestial life and get out of this bodily life. So the Manichaeans were a form of Gnosticism, and they too were fatalistic. They believed that sexual intercourse was a satanic activity. So they had two groups: the elect, who would pledge and live in abstinence of all sexual activity and all eating of meat and various forms of pleasure. And then the others were called the followers. If they wouldn't do that discipline, they could still be part of the movement. But they were in two categories, two classes. And their ideas as well were fatalistic, that man does not have a free will, but everything is between these two powers, like the general Gnostic system is. Well, in reference to Gnosticism, there are several places where the Bible addresses that. And if you understand Gnosticism, then you'll see what is being said there does refer to Gnosticism. One of the beliefs of Gnosticism is called docetism. Because they believed that the body was evil, and that they believed Jesus was a good man, they did not believe that he had a real physical material body, because physical material bodies are evil. So they said Jesus appeared to have a physical human body, and that, but he didn't really. He just seemed to be. That's the word they seemed to have. So John, the Apostle John, in his gospel writes, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And in the 14th verse of the first chapter, he says, and the Word became flesh. Now that's very significant if people are around who are denying that Jesus actually took upon himself human flesh and lived in the human body. So that would be very pertinent for that. In John's first epistle, he also addresses this by what he says. For example, in the first chapter of 1 John, he says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we beheld and our hands handled concerning the word of life. And the life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness, and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. So John is saying this man that we know as Jesus, he came from the Father and manifested the Father to us in human flesh that we could see, that we could hear, we could touch. So there he is countering the Gnostic idea and claim that Jesus did not have a real human body because real human bodies are evil, and Jesus was not an evil person. He had no evil in him. John continues in the first chapter and says, if we say we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves and the truth is not in us. Now that's exactly what the Gnostics said. They believed that they had spirits that were pure, and it was their bodies that were sinful. So they claimed, we have no sin. It's our bodies that sin. Now, many of them were very ascetic, denied themselves eating pleasures and sexual pleasures and things like that so that they wouldn't stir up the body's appetites and that sort of thing. Others were just completely lawless and indulged to the maximum because they said, well, it's our bodies are sinning, not our spirits are sinning. It's in our bodies. So why do you need a Savior if you have no sin? And that's what John is addressing. He says, if we say we have no sin, who said that? The Gnostics. And we are deceiving ourselves and the truth is not in us. Then he says in verse 10, if we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar. Now the Gnostics were saying, we have no sin, we have not sinned, it's our bodies that are sinning. Well, they also wanted to incorporate themselves in the Christian faith. Now you don't incorporate yourself into the Christian faith, which is salvation for sinners. You don't need the salvation that is in the Christian faith because it's for sinners. So they were trying to take over the Christian movement, but yet they denied they had sin. And John is addressing that claim here in the first chapter of John. And in the second epistle of John, in the 7th verse, he says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. And specifically addressing the Gnostic concepts that Jesus did not come in the flesh. And John says that they are deceivers. So the Bible does address the problem and the issue of Gnosticism very clearly and addresses their central point that the body is sinful, but the spirit is not. And he said, well, you don't need to be Christians if you have no sin. But you claim your sin is in your body, and you claim Jesus didn't come in the flesh. He says, John is saying, these are deceivers. The view of Augustine on free will is a very important question, specifically if he had agreed with the early church. The question is very complicated because we have to ask, which Augustine are we going to look at? We have 4 phases of Augustine's life that we need to examine. The first phase is when he was a pagan. Pagan meaning he had no religious affiliation. He was kind of just no specific religion that he conformed to or adopted. This went on till he was about 19 years of age. When he was 16, he took up a relationship with a young woman, and she bore him a son when he was 17. At 17, he went away to college, and Augustine had in his mind the question of evil from his early childhood. The question of evil, it bothered him. He wanted an answer to the question of evil. And this figures very much into his ideas of whether or not man has free will. Now, by the question of evil, he meant, why do bad things happen to people? He wasn't talking about the evil that men do, that men originate. He wasn't talking about what is the origin of man's evil doing. But by evil, he meant any pain that he suffered, any discontent, any discouragement, any disappointments, any bad emotions that he didn't appreciate, all of that he called evil. And he wanted to know where it came from, if there was any answer to it. So when he was away at college, now we have a second phase where at college he became an adherent to the Manichaean religion. And the Manichaean religion, as we talked about, is under the umbrella of the Gnostic beliefs. So as a Manichaean in college, he accepted and embraced the Manichaean religion that taught him that the reason why there's evil is because there's this war going on between the kingdom of light and the prince of light, and the kingdom of darkness and the prince of darkness. And so that is why you have such terrible experiences, such painful emotions, such discouragements, bad things happening to you, why you have so much unfulfilled desires and things like that, because this war is going on. And nothing you can do about it. So the cause and the source of evil is outside of you. There's nothing you can do about it. You have no free will to change it. So in that phase of his life, which lasted 9 years, Augustine did not believe that man has free will, because that was what the Manichaeans taught him during that period of time. He studied rhetoric in college, and this is his profession. He was offered a position in Rome. So he left North Africa in the city of Tagaste, which is his hometown, and went to Rome to take this position. And when he was in Rome, he became very skeptical. The Manichaean faith that he adopted was no longer giving him sufficient answers to his dilemma about what's the source of evil. So he became skeptical. And now he's in a skeptical state of mind. And he goes to Rome, and there he encounters the teachings of what is called Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is a revival of the ideas of Plato through a man named Plotinus, who had an academy there in Rome. Now, Plotinus was in Rome about the years 230 to 270 when he died, and he started a school, and he had many disciples there, and his views, his philosophy spread throughout Italy and Rome, and became very powerful throughout the Western Empire there. And Plotinus taught a view that Augustine adopted, and that is that everything comes out of one, that there's the great one, the good, and everything emanates from that. So there really is no such thing as evil, because everything is going according to this master plan, this master activity of this one perfect entity, being. Not even, didn't call him a person, but some entity, some being, the essence of all being. So Augustine accepted that idea that everything is being caused by this. Again, he was taught that man does not have a free will because all things are caused by this higher supreme entity or being. So he left Rome and went to Milan, Italy, into his fourth phase. And that is, he decided to become a Christian. And under the teaching of Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, he was taught the Christian ideas, and he was baptized in 387 AD as a Christian. And being taught as a Christian, he was taught that man has a free will, as the other church fathers believed. And so he accepted that. And then he would write these long articles and refutations of the Manichaean faith that he held for 9 years. And several books that he wrote against the Manichaeans, he has proofs in there that he lays out that man has a free will. So he was refuting the Manichaean belief that everything is fate and man doesn't have free will in these books that we have, whereby Augustine refutes the idea we have no free will and builds a complete argument series that demonstrates that man does have free will. So at that fourth stage of Augustine's life, he asserts that man has free will. In his earlier writings, he has one called On Free Will, and he lays out all of these arguments that prove that man has free will. And then later on, about 15 years later, a man comes from England, a bishop, and he's going around Rome teaching people that man has free will. And part of his evidence is he keeps quoting Augustine, because Augustine made these books and proved that man has free will. But by that time, in this later phase, Augustine changes his mind and begins to teach that, according to the Bible, as Augustine viewed it, a man doesn't have a free will, that everything is predestined. So now the man who is quoting Augustine saying man has free will, his name is Pelagius, is now refuted by Augustine. So Augustine's refuting his own writings, his own ideas in this latter stage of Augustine's life. In this fourth stage that I was describing of Augustine's life and his search for the question, where does evil come from? He taught under the Christian influence that man has free will, and therefore he had the ability to disobey God. He exercised his free will, disobeyed God, and therefore fell into condemnation. He taught that very explicitly, and other people saw him in agreement with the church fathers, and what the church believed up to that time was very consistent. But as time went on, Augustine changed his view on that as well. And around 400 to 410 began to teach what is known as predestination, and that man sins not because he chooses to, but because God predestines what every man will do. He said things like, man goes to perdition because God decreed it, not because man chose anything, or that man chooses to disobey and not believe God because God predestines. So that faith does not come as a result of a choice of man, but it comes as a result of God's predestination and imposing of that predestinating will of God. So Augustine eliminated the idea that man has free will when he had this change of view in his own theology. Now, why did he have this change of view? Because he had adopted the philosophy of Neoplatonism, which says that there is this one being at the core of everything, and that this one being is producing all of the activity, the world mind, and then the world soul, and then finally the material world. But it is all produced by this one being, and all this activity generates it to where it will eventually return to this one being. So everything is predetermined what will happen by the energy and activity of this one being. And Augustine took that paradigm, he called this one being God, and took the Christian scriptures and brought them together and combined them so that he was teaching Platonic philosophy and Christian theology combined. And many people at this time rejected his views. There was 18 bishops in the country of Italy who refused to accept Augustine's views, and they left and went east towards Constantinople because they would refuse to accept his ideas and considered him to be teaching false doctrine. 100 years after Augustine's death, the Second Council of Orange, a church council, met and they discussed Augustine's views, in particular his last days views, his last 25 years, where he taught that God predestines what will happen to every man, and man has no free will. And at that church council of Orange in 529 AD, they withdrew or took out Augustine's view on predestination as unacceptable to the Christian faith, and they rejected it. So many rejected it at the time he said it, and they rejected it officially at a church council in 529 AD. Another significant thing to know is that 4 years before Augustine died, he wrote a volume called Retractations, whereby he went back on his previous writings and analyzed them, and then he would make statements in this book whereby he would say, now my view is different than it was then. And in this book, he says that when he was teaching about man has free will and all those quotations that we can find, he says in this final volume that what he really meant was that the man that God created had free will. But after that man sinned, he lost his free will, and he passed on to all of his descendants the lack of free will. So we need to understand that Augustine changed his mind, and then later on he tells us what he really meant, which isn't what he said at all in the first place. So here is where you have confusion when you read Augustine, to where you can see him saying two contrary things, and thus you have a confusion. There are similarities between Gnosticism and Augustine's views. And the Gnosticism that influenced Augustine was the Manichaeism. And Manichaeism taught that matter is evil. And Augustine came to teach that our bodies are sinful. Our physical material bodies are sinful. The Manichaeism taught that everything is fatalistic. We have no free will. Augustine taught that everything is predestined by God. We have no free will. The Gnostics taught that when we receive this special knowledge, we shall ascend to the city of light. And Augustine wrote a book called The City of God, and paralleled the concept of Manichaeism, that there are two cities or two kingdoms. And Augustine wrote that there's a city of God and there's a city of man, just like the Manichaees taught that there's a city of light and the city of darkness. So we have those parallels that are important to see, that Augustine borrowed some of these influences from Manichaeism. Manichaees also taught that sexual intercourse was satanic. Augustine taught that through sexual intercourse we pass on evil or sinfulness to our children. So I see these as significant parallels between the two systems. Augustine's views had a great influence upon the Reformation. His ideas were considered to be historically authentic and authoritative in the Church, the Catholic Church. And when the time came for the Reformation, his views were considered to be the views that the Reformation went back to. So they were reforming the Church. They changed forms. They changed the form of leadership, so where there was not a single pope, but that they took upon themselves the priesthood of the believers. They changed the form of the church worship times to where they did not believe that the body and blood of Christ, the sacraments became the literal body and blood of Christ. They changed the form of the ministry. They changed the forms. They reformed. But they didn't touch Augustine's doctrine. Augustine had great influence upon the two major people of the Reformation, John Calvin and Martin Luther. John Calvin wrote several volumes of what he calls his Institutes, and he devoted it to the King of France. And the point of devoting it to the King of France is he wanted the King of France to try to believe that the reformers were the true Christians. And to try to demonstrate that, Calvin quotes Augustine over 100 times to try to demonstrate to the King of France that these reformers are not breakaways, but they're going back to the original, back to true Christianity. But Calvin went back to late Augustine when he denied free will. He went back to late Augustine that said everything is predestined by God, rather than to the earlier Christian Augustine who said man has free will and is responsible. So John Calvin was greatly influenced by Augustine and passed that influence on in his books called the Institutes. Martin Luther was greatly influenced by Augustine. Luther was a monk of the Augustinian order. So he was taught what Augustine had taught and been passed down through the order of the Augustinian monks. Martin Luther later in his life wrote a book called The Bondage of the Will. And in there he asserts that man does not have free will. Man has a will like a horse. And whoever sits in the saddle controls the horse. So if God is sitting in the saddle or the will of a man, then man will do what God commands him to and will obey because God is controlling his will. But if Satan is sitting in, quote, the will of man, then Satan will control his will. But man has no control over his own will. So Augustine had great influence upon both of these, who were the major ones that we look to as the Reformation, and out of their ideas was passed on the Augustinian views to historically what has been called the Reformed Church or Reformed views or things like that. Does it really matter what Christians think about free will? We hear people say, well, my thing is just, I just love God and I'm not going to get involved in these doctrinal debates. But the question is, can you love God? Do you have the ability to love God? Can you choose to love God? And now you're faced with the exact question we've been discussing. Do you have the ability to do what you know God requires you to do? And now we're talking, does it matter that we have free will? Now, if it doesn't matter that we have free will, then nothing matters. If we don't have free will, then everything is determined or nothing matters. But if we do have free will, then we're responsible. If we don't have free will, then we're not responsible. If we have free will, then we're required to obey God. If we don't have free will, we're not obligated to obey God. Therefore, we're not obligated to love God. So as you can see, it does matter. Now, somebody was talking to me one day and said, I believe God predestines everything that happens. And I responded back and say, well, you know what? I believe that man has free will, and God predestined me to believe that. And he laughed. Now, if a person believes that God predestines everything, then it must be that God predestines for people to disagree on these subjects. So is God predestining some to believe a lie and others to believe the truth? And if it is so, then man doesn't have free will, but everything that man believes, whatever he believes, is what God would have him to believe. So our beliefs are determined by what we choose to believe, not what God predestines us to believe. As somebody once said, I believe in free will. I don't have a choice. And that's the actuality of this question about free will. Everyone knows we have free will, otherwise we wouldn't blame anybody for what they do, because they couldn't avoid it. We wouldn't have courts of law. We wouldn't have law enforcement. We wouldn't have penalties. We wouldn't have punishments. God would not punish sinners because they didn't choose to sin. God would not reward saints because they didn't choose to be saints. We would all basically be trees or dogs or rocks without a free will. It does matter what we think about this question of free will, because we are responsible for our choices, and therefore it matters. If the modern church were to investigate Augustine's view of free will, it would produce a radical change in what's called Christianity. If they were to re-examine and see his failure to understand man's true moral nature as God created him, and the true consequences of sin, the modern church would begin to rise up and hold every human being responsible to obey God, and would give no excuses for man's disobedience to God. Every man's character would be known to be true because he has chosen whether he obeys God or not. The humiliation that the church has suffered because of failure, moral failures in its leadership for so long, would come to an end because the church would rise up and hold every minister and church member accountable to obey God and love God with all of his heart, because they would know that the man could do that, and therefore he must do that. We would hold politicians accountable for their behavior and their character. We would hold fathers and men accountable for their behavior if we believed that every man could possibly obey God and had this free will. We would hold every woman and every mother accountable for how she raises her children. There would be this rise of accountability, and then there would be this rise of conviction over people's sin. And then there would be this humbling before God that they are responsible for their sins. And we would see an awakening that we've never yet seen before. These would be some of the things that would happen if the modern church would investigate the Augustinian views that had been passed to it and took a fresh view of it and saw it for what it really is. And that is, man does have the ability to obey God. And we would see a radical change. And so my views have changed as where I come to realize that my ability of free will means I can do everything God has commanded me. God would never command me to do something that is unjust or that I cannot do. So as my development of my understanding of free will happened, I began to realize that I could do everything God commanded me. Therefore, I could be responsible for all my decisions. Therefore, God's law was good. There was nothing wrong with his law. And the problem was with me if I did not obey God. What brought about the change in my understanding of free will is understanding the moral law of God. I was previously misunderstanding that God required me to have certain feelings, certain desires, to not have certain feelings, to not have certain desires. And so I thought I was obligated to have those, and when I didn't have those, I thought I was in disobedience. And that therefore, I couldn't do everything that God said I should do. But when I learned that the moral law only requires me to choose to love God, it doesn't require what my feelings will be. It doesn't require that I have certain desires, certain emotions, certain passions, things like that. It only requires me to make a choice to love him first above all and love my neighbor as myself. When I understood that, then I understood what I had control of by my free will. And when I saw that, then I understood I could do that, regardless of how I felt, or regardless of what I desired. I could obey God, and that's what made the difference. With this change of view and understanding correctly God's moral law and what it required, then in light of that, I saw my true character, and that I was disobeying God. I saw what I was responsible for. Then I could properly examine whether I was fulfilling my responsibilities. And when I did that, I saw that I was not fulfilling my responsibilities. I was not using my free will to do what God commanded me to do. And therefore I became convicted of my sin and saw that God righteously should punish me because I had no excuse for sin. Now, the positive side to that is that when I saw I was responsible for all my sin, it was the first time in my life that I saw that I could repent of all of my sin. Since I was the cause of all my sin, I could be the one who stopped all of my sin. And that became the good news because I saw I could repent of everything and meet God's condition to forgive me. And that is, turn from all my sin, stop all my sin, and give myself to love Him with all my heart. And in doing that, my relationship with God completely changed because now I became a loving, obedient disciple of Jesus instead of a rebellious man against the law of God. Thank God.